Hello, and welcome to A Sound Constitution here on CHLY 101.7 FM, a show where we focus on health topics important to our community. This year's team is made up of 8 third-year VIU nursing students. Our goal is to demystify health issues and address common misconceptions by sharing evidence-informed information from a variety of reliable resources. All information provided on our show will be available in our show notes on our Facebook and Instagram pages. We want to remind our listeners that the information presented in this show is for educational purposes only and does not replace the advice of your primary health care professional. If you have any questions or concerns about what's being discussed, please feel free to reach out to us on Facebook at A Sound Constitution, Instagram at CHLY A Sound Constitution, all one word, Twitter at ASC_VIU, or email us at asoundconstitution@gmail.com. We would like to start our show by acknowledging that we are on the unceded territory of the Sunemu people, with a broadcasting range that overlaps the Kawatsan and Sliamon territories. This acknowledgement is done with gratitude to the Sunemu people and with the intention to increase awareness about truth and reconciliation processes and efforts here on Vancouver Island. Additional information and resources surrounding Sunemu history, reconciliation, protocol, and land acknowledgement can be found on our Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube pages. Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into our show today. My name is Lara, and I will be your host, joined by my co-hosts, Stella, Shan, and Cedric. In today's episode, we will be discussing psychedelic medicines and their health-promoting potential. Later in our episode, I will be sitting down with Dr. Shannon Dames, who is the spearheading founder and current member of the Roots to Thrive program, as well as Vancouver Island University's Psychedelic-Assisted Therapy Graduate Certificate Education Program, and VIU's Not-Semont Center for Psychedelic Research. We will start off our show today with a segment from Stella, who will give us an overview of how psychedelic medicines are emerging as a relevant potential treatment for what are often referred to as treatment-resistant mental health conditions.
Did you know that psychedelic-assisted therapy and psychedelic-like medicines alike are being studied to help people with symptoms of what are called treatment-resistant mental health conditions, as well as end-of-life distress? When someone with a mental health condition is labeled as resistant to treatment, it means their symptoms were not adequately reduced from anywhere from 2 to 5 different treatment types. About 1/3 of people with major depressive disorder don't respond in a satisfactory way to antidepressant treatments, leaving them to look out for different kinds of treatments to relieve symptoms. And did you know that the word psychedelic happens to mean mind manifesting or soul manifesting? Many recent studies have been looking at the significant effects that ketamine in particular can have on people suffering from treatment-resistant mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. This is one of the reasons why ketamine is currently being studied for its potential as a future clinical treatment. Ketamine is an anesthetic or pain reliever, so it is not a traditional psychedelic medicine. It is being studied frequently because it is legal, safe, and easily tolerable in most cases, and when it is given in doses too low to have pain-relieving effects, it creates psychedelic effects that can increase the effectiveness of psychotherapy. Interestingly, recent studies published in a journal called Therapeutic Advances in Psychopharmacology have found that people with treatment-resistant mental health conditions can see significant reductions in their symptoms of depression, seeing a 79% improvement, anxiety, seeing a 91% improvement, and PTSD, where 86% of the people who screened positive before the study are now screening negative. These results were measured 2 weeks following a 12-week program, including group psychotherapy combined with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. Many reviews of the research on the topic of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy are showing promising results that highlight the potential of this psychedelic-like medicine to quickly and sustainably reduce or eliminate symptoms of depression and other psychological challenges such as anxiety and PTSD.
Thank you to Stella for increasing our knowledge regarding the use of psychedelics in current research. Next up, we have Cedric, who will share a segment featuring a look at the history of psychedelics to help us gain perspective on the long journey that psychedelic medicines have taken to this point in time where we are now experiencing what many researchers are calling a psychedelic research renaissance.
Interest into the usage of psychedelic drugs in psychiatry began in the early 20th century with exploration into the effects of mescaline, a hallucinogen that comes from the peyote cactus. There was curiosity around the possibility that the effects of psychedelics could uncover the underlying basis for psychiatric disorders. Psychedelics were originally called psychotomimetics, meaning psychosis mimicking, or hallucinogens, which means a substance that produces hallucinations. The term psychedelics includes LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin. The German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin was one of the first researchers that explored mental illness using experimentally induced psychosis. Kraepelin, alongside his students, wanted to establish experimental methods to investigate the action of drugs on mental processes. While working in Kraepelin's clinic, two researchers decided to study mescaline in order to reproduce certain mental conditions. Dramatic effects on time perception were noticed, as well as visual hallucinations. Many researchers continued to delve into the effects of mescaline over the years. Among them was a researcher named Gutman, who observed 60 subjects after the administration of mescaline. Some of the symptoms observed include changes in mood and sensory perception, hypersensitivity to noises, altered perception of movement and one's body, and various hallucinations. Gutman recognized the potential for therapeutic influence when people were in these states, as well as gaining understanding into how people with psychiatric disorders such as schizophrenia experience the world. The discovery of LSD in 1943 marked the next historical phase of psychedelic research. The effects of LSD were accidentally discovered by Albert Hofmann, a natural products chemist working in Switzerland. The first scientific study on the effects of LSD was published in 1947 by the psychiatrist Werner Stoll. He administered LSD to 16 normal subjects and 6 treatment-resistant patients with schizophrenia. In the normal subjects, the LSD produced feelings of euphoria, visual patterns, feeling young, beautiful, and reborn. The effects were not as noticeable in the patients with schizophrenia, but Stoll noticed that, and I quote, LSD seemed to facilitate the psychotherapeutic process by allowing repressed material to pass easily into consciousness. The psychotherapeutic process refers to what occurs between and within a client and therapist during the course of therapy. Research into the effects of LSD continued until 1966, when Sandoz Pharmaceuticals stopped distributing it because they had not anticipated that LSD would be used for recreational purposes. LSD was used by anti-war protesters and so-called hippies in the 1960s and indirectly led to the war on drugs. The Food and Drug Administration created new rigid criteria that mandated that a drug should be shown to be safe and effective prior to approval. It was very hard to prove that LSD and psychedelics were effective compared to other drugs, and this marked the end of LSD in psychotherapy. Another important aspect of the history of psychedelics research is the role that the psychologists Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert played at Harvard University. At Harvard in 1960, they began to explore the effects of psychedelics on the human mind. They both argued that psychology should include how cognition, perception, and emotion are affected by mind-altering substances, as psychology is not only the study of the mind, but its relationship to the brain, body, and environment. Alpert and Leary started the Harvard Psilocybin Project. Psilocybin is a hallucinogen that naturally occurs in certain mushrooms, and sought to document real-time experiences of volunteers who were given the substance. In 1962, faculty members at Harvard were concerned about the safety of this research and critiqued Leary and Alpert's research methods. Alpert and Leary were even accused of actively promoting the recreational use of psychedelics. Alpert and Leary both insisted that their intentions were purely scientific, but they were later both fired from Harvard and banished from academia. I mentioned that Alpert and Leary studied the effects of psilocybin, but what is the history behind this substance? Psilocybin has been used by people in Central America and other regions for centuries, but it remained outside of Western societies until the 1950s. An American mycologist, who is someone who studies fungi, named R. Gordon Wasson took a trip to Mexico and participated in a ritual involving psychedelic mushrooms. This experience was captured in a 1957 article in Life magazine titled Seeking the Magic Mushroom, which introduced psychedelic mushrooms to the public. That same year, the chemist Albert Hofmann, who was the same person that discovered LSD, isolated psilocybin from a mushroom. Sandow's Pharmaceutical began distributing psilocybin for use in psychiatric studies as a result of Hofmann's discovery. Throughout the 1960s, many trials were conducted on psilocybin until it was designated a Schedule I drug, which is defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. It was designated as a Schedule I drug in 1970 by the United States Drug Enforcement Agency, as part of the War on Drugs. What is the War on Drugs, and what started this movement? The war on drugs in the United States started in the 1900s when a restrictive approach was adopted towards the use of various recreational drugs. In 1909, the importation and use of opium was banned, and in 1914, the Harrison Act was passed, which taxed the production and distribution of cocaine and various opiates. The medical use of drugs also became more regulated, so much so that by 1938, more than 25,000 American doctors have been accused of a crime due to the illegal prescription of drugs. In the 1960s, the rise in the movement for recreational drug use led to fears regarding a drug epidemic. Richard Nixon used the public's fear regarding drug use, specifically among conservative voters, and was elected in 1968. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act was passed, which created more regulation around drugs based on their potential for addiction. Nixon officially declared the war on drugs in 1971 and said that drug abuse was public enemy number one. Mandatory sentences for both drug possession and distribution were then enforced. However, there is a darker secret behind the war on drugs. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief, stated that the war on drugs was meant to oppress the anti-war left and black people. The war on drugs wasn't simply about drugs, it was a war on the poor and marginalized individuals within society. This concludes my segment today on the history of psychedelics. All of the resources used in this segment can be found in our show notes. Thank you for listening.
Thank you to Cedric for a fascinating look at the history of psychedelics. A Sound Constitution is a health-based radio show produced by local VIU Bachelors of Science in Nursing students, airing every Thursday from 2 to 3 p.m. here on CHLY 101.7 FM. We look to demystify and provide evidence-based information for you to make informed decisions about your health. Now, before we dive into my interview with Dr. Shannon Dames, let me share a little more about this inspiring human. Dr. Dames serves as the Visioning and Development Lead, Roots to Thrive Innovations Co-Chair, and Organization Steward. She is a health professional investigator and nursing professor on Vancouver Island. And she is a published author with expertise in nursing practice, resilience development, and psychedelic-assisted therapy research and education. Her current work focuses on the development of research infrastructure that supports psychedelic service delivery and education development with Vancouver Island University. So thank you so much for joining us for this interview, Shannon. We really appreciate your time. First of all, could you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to study nursing?
Yeah, honestly, I grew up in a bit of a well below the poverty line, single mom, and in a small town. And my mom really struggled with employment, lots of kind of like multiple jobs to make ends meet. And I remember in high school thinking like, I need something really practical, and I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do. And nursing is like, this feels like a very not glamorous response, but it was like a survival move in a few different ways. Like I knew I could take care of myself. And I would say from there, there was a lot of years I just thought, I don't know if I fit in nursing. Like I'm more of the like creative type. I don't really like being stuck in structures or being told what to do. I'm more of like an oppositionalist. And I ended up in a field that can feel pretty confining and scripted. And yeah, and then, the bedside part felt pretty great because I love the relationships, but there was no time for the bedside part. So lots of challenges early. And I think finding this pathway through research and medicine-assisted therapies in an emerging field was a bit of a sweet spot in it as a nurse, because I could, there's a lot of creation involved. And I also, I've come to understand nursing and the principles of nursing in a different way, like a much more appreciative way, where we come from and who we are and what we're capable of, and the leadership that comes with that too. So yeah, it's been like full circle around, I don't know how the heck I got here, to I'm really glad I got here, even if I didn't think my way through it in a big way.
Wow, that is a beautiful scoping response. I love it. Thank you for sharing a little piece of yourself there. And just to go further into that topic, what influenced you to study psychedelics and mental health in particular? Because it's such a unique area of study.
Yeah, thank you. When I was in my early 20s, when I was working in the emergency room, a colleague had talked about an experience that she had in Peru. And I was very curious about it. And part of it because when I came into nursing at a pretty young age, I had a lot of trauma, lots of undealt with stuff that I didn't really have time to unpack before I wanted to just hop into life, and somehow thought it would just magically go away. And it did not, and it caused all sorts of side effects on the mental health side and behaviorally and sabotage wise, like all of it burned out very colorfully a couple times. So and I remember, like years later thinking like, I've been through therapy, I've like done all the things I'm supposed to do to like go clean up the basement of my childhood, and still really struggling. Meanwhile, like overcompensating in the nursing end, like really successful on a career front and really kind of struggling on a personal front. So when I went into my doctorate, which was a focus on resilience, very much a personal, how the heck do humans do this? Why does one human seem to do so much better than others, even though they have very similar worlds they live in? And really wanting to know that on a personal level and understanding it. When I graduated from my doctorate in that, I went to Peru. Instead of walking across the stage, I walked across Peru. I went there for almost a month, left my young kids at home with my partner, and this was kind of something I needed to do for me. I had an experience down there in the jungle with ayahuasca, and it was like the first time I have a recollection since probably early in my childhood. And honestly, I don't even really remember a lot of that, but like really being in my body and like feeling compassion for myself and having a lot more insights into this life that I had carved out kind of from the neck up, without really much connection with my body at all. And how much suffering was in my body, like really understanding why I didn't spend a lot of time there. And the compassion to like move through what I needed to move through to kind of reconcile with a lot of that. So it was a big, in terms of this like world that we're in, where we hear the word treatment resistant a lot in the mental health field, and it's applying to a lot more Canadians these days. That was a lot of my experience, was feeling like nothing works. Like people would give me an idea and it'd be like a drop in the bucket. It really wouldn't make an impact, like a noticeable impact. And this was the first time I had a noticeable impact. Like it really made a big jarring, it was a big jarring experience in a good way and in a hard way. So when I came back, I was done school, like I've been a student almost my entire life. And what's next? It was this weaving of really understanding resilience differently, and how these medicines, they're not magic bullets. They're like adjuncts. I would say like they're facilitators of loosening some of these really rigid ego structures and patterns and belief systems that we come to just assume are true. And there's no room to change them because they're an assumed truth. And these medicines really have the capacity to to step outside of those assumed truths, and that creates a potential for change. That's where it starts. Like they can really facilitate a start, and then, you know, the rest actually sustaining change and like really allowing those like new belief systems and ideas to germinate. Like that's a whole nother process. But it became like a realization that I think sometimes, not all people, but some people need these medicines in order to just create the potential for change.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's really going to give our listeners a really good perspective on what brought you to this work. Now, could you describe a little bit about the various aspects of your work that relate to psychedelic medicine? So I know you have quite a few different roles.
Yeah, so I work full-time at Vancouver Island University, and I also serve as a health professional investigator for Research BC, the Michael Smith Foundation, and the John Hecht Foundation. And what that means is basically I have some of my teaching is bought out by research and development funds to work at these forging how these medicine-assisted therapies fit into our public systems, into our healthcare systems, and it just contributing to a developing field, which in our time is very rare for us to be living in a time where we have a developing field. Many of our medical fields and kind of ways of knowing, doing, and healing are relatively established in the West. And the fact that this is kind of coming in at this time in our history is really exciting. And also, yeah, really fluid, and there's a lot of inflammation around it and a lot of uncertainty, and all the things that challenge systems are very much happening in this field of psychedelics as well. So that's a lot of what I do is kind of navigating some of these political structures, working with research and development. We have an education system, or a program that we started at VIU last year. So we're in the second year now of a postgraduate certificate in psychedelics for those that want to support as therapists or clinicians in the field. And I also have a role in the kind of visionary and innovation for Roots to Thrive Society for Psychedelic Therapy, which is a nonprofit that focuses on resilience development and works with psychedelic adjuncts to kind of further those efforts. That was a long answer.
That's a perfect answer. And you touched a little bit on how psychedelics and the application of them in healthcare is becoming a more relevant topic of discussion, and particularly in treatment-resistant mental health conditions, or what we call those conditions. Could you describe why you believe psychedelic research is experiencing a powerful renaissance at this point in time?
Yeah, it's like there's two reasons. We are in a time in our history that I think is more fluid than it's been for decades. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of change happening, not just in Canada, but in the world. Change in relationships between countries, change in environment, change in the job market, change in our financial systems. We have mental health conditions that are increasing, that we no longer have solutions to address in a meaningful way, and they're increasing faster than we can treat them. Our systems are under more pressure than they've been under for a long time in terms of staffing challenges, burnout, and specifically healthcare systems. So it's psychedelics, and I maybe just to further that, is we're as a people, as a human race, in terms of resilience. I'll speak for the Western world. We've been in a capitalist, commercialized, industrialized culture now for a couple hundred years and onward. And we have become a pretty lonely people, meaning a lot of this individualism that has helped us industrialize and capitalize and move things forward in some ways in society has also moved us backwards in other ways in society, in that like we are more insecure people than we've been for a long time because we don't live in communities. We we understand communities conceptually, we talk about them, but we don't have the felt sense in general of being in communities, in our bodies and in our security systems. So what that means is that we are more insecure than I think we've been for a very long time, and the mental health trends are underscoring that. Psychedelic medicines are not, and I'm going to keep saying this, they're not magic bullets, because when they're used that way, it's disappointing. And they're a substance. And many would say a spiritual substance, however you want to look at it. There's something that we can be in relationship with that can help us see. It's like almost like a diagnostic tool to see a path forward. But in terms of taking the steps on that path forward, that there's a lot more kind of personal, I guess I'd say, initiative and support needed. And maybe to wrap this up in a nutshell, I'd say we have become, it's been a slippery slope to a pretty disconnected kind of people. And we all experience it. We're all in the same petri dish here in industrialized countries. And psychedelic medicines are connecting medicines. So there's like a real opportunity to connect the things that have been separated. And it also requires us to put ourselves in different petri dishes than what got us here. So there's like a both end. Then we're not just going to put this in the water and it's going to change things, because we're still in a toxic culture. But what we can do is see what the changes are that we need to make in order to deal with the toxins in our culture so that we can flourish in a different way as humans.
Well, it sounds like there's quite a bit of potential to these medicines, and the sky's the limit, as long as we use them in a way that is appropriate for each individual. Hey? Yeah. So we'd love to share a little bit more information about your nonprofit and the work that you do in our local community with our listeners. Could you describe the Roots to Thrive organization a little bit more?
Yeah. So the Rosa Thrive began with a grant from 2018 with, it was actually a partnership collaboration between Island Health, Vancouver Island University, and the Michael Smith granting agency, which funded a student. And then we had some kind of volunteers come together from the healthcare system. What was unique about it is those of us that kind of leaned in on a in-kind volunteer effort was that we were doing it for personal reasons. So we were like meeting in coffee shops, having dinners, like really talking about how we as healthcare professionals that are in trauma-laden work environments and have had a long history of it, and lots of funding has gone into taking trauma-informed practice courses, learning about resilience, all of these, but more learning at the level of the mind, and really not reconnecting us to our bodies and our life source, our heart spaces, addressing some of the like noisiness in our bodies that trauma tends to lead, and especially these careers that we have that are just, like I said, trauma laden. So even if you don't come from a lot of trauma, you end up being exposed to a lot just by the nature of the work that we do. So that's kind of how Roots started, was a lot of personal conversations from healthcare workers that were really interested in trying to make a difference and bring something new forward that might make a bigger dent than kind of these more head-driven processes and programs. We developed Roots to Thrive initially as a 6-week program, and got additional funds to run it through with some of the local hospitals, and ran some just initiative or some quality improvement kind of early research on them, trying to understand how we iterate it to improve it so that it becomes more effective. We did that until 2020. And then we got another grant in 2020 once we had a pretty solid container and had run it multiple times, including with community partners. And we're feeling pretty good about the results that were happening, and also the team being part of this. So we were getting more resilient and we were getting better, just even being in this kind of tune. We got a CIHR grant, a Canadian federal grant for adding ketamine-assisted therapy to this container, the resilience container, Roots to Thrive. And that's really what began this idea of like, how do we focus on resilience and community and connection and really work with these medicines to help facilitate deeper, faster growth and relief. And from there, then once psilocybin became available, we included psilocybin, and MDMA is now available as well. So it's been an iterative process. Mm-hmm. It became a nonprofit in late 2021, moving out of Vancouver Island University, really just because running a medical system clinic that's iterative and innovative can be pretty tricky out of an academic institution. So Roots to Thrive still continues to associate in a number of ways, but it's a separate entity now.
Oh, okay. And could you give us a little overview of like the guiding principles of Roots to Thrive?
Yeah, so the whole program is hinging on there's two concepts in resilience, and it's congruence, which is a concept by Carl Rogers. He's like a seminal researcher and psychologist. And congruence is our ability to be in the world as we are. It is, many of us in these cultures have learned how to put displays on, say yes when we really mean no, lots of people pleasing, lots of doing the things we should do, not the things we want to do. That all of that is our acts of incongruence, and a lot of individualist cultures are very incongruent cultures. When we're incongruent, not showing up as we are and not actualizing as we want to and feel inspired to, we become the consequence of shame. So the more incongruent we are, the more shame we carry. And so shame, as it builds in us individually, when unaddressed, eventually ends up spilling over unconsciously onto others. So it's also why we have a shame-driven society in a lot of ways, because we inadvertently, unconsciously control ourselves and each other through that to kind of homogenize, assimilate, do what we're supposed to do through the motivation of shame. And when you have a shameful culture, you don't tend to also have a lot of mental health conditions and a lot of addictions and a lot of lack of control and a lack of choice. And so becoming congruent is both a resilience. If the more congruent you are, the more resilient you are, the more liberated you are, the more better mental health you tend to have. To become congruent, you have to believe that you are unconditionally, positively regarded. You have to be able to give that to yourself. So, but you can't actually do that unless you're taught that you are worth that. And many of us don't believe we're worth that, which is why we have adapted and changed for so many people for so long. So it's a practice. A lot of the Roots to Thrive program is built around, it's kind of one of two, resilience and like how we become more congruent, and we actually like practice becoming more congruent so that it grows inside the program. And then that kind of spills into other areas of life. Mm-hmm. The other principle is sense of coherence, and it is about the ability to live a life that has meaning, to feel confident in your ability to address life's challenges in a way that you feel like you can overcome them, and they can even feel like stimulating. Like you might even get curious about like, oh, I got this, right? Versus if you don't have confidence, I talk about it like a wave at times. If you're on the ocean and you've got waves coming at you, if you didn't have high sense of coherence and there were big waves, you are at high risk of feeling like you're going to be below the waterline pretty darn quick, and those waves are very scary. If you have high sense coherence, you would be the person with the surfboard that's got quite a few skills to surf those waves, and those waves can look pretty exciting. So it's this difference between like what creates a stress response in these bodies is very much around our sense of coherence. And the other piece is meaning. Like a lot of, even with nursing, there's a lot of tasks that could be perceived as menial, like could feel really menial, right? And annoying and irritating, all those things. It's like, I didn't sign up for this. When there's no meaning, that's how it feels. And it actually is a really leads to burnout and hostility, all the things that we often see in our work environments. When there is a strong meaning attached to what we do and why we do it, and that we're in a place of choice, we feel like we're in a place of choice, those menial tasks can actually be quite rewarding. It can be like a real honor to be working with somebody who has even like soiled the bed, right? And in a way of like, if their meaning is there, like, I'm going to uphold their dignity. I'm going to be the person that like shows them unconditional positive regard in like the most vulnerable circumstance. And what an honor that I get to be here and be this person. That becomes like a meaningful experience and something that could be really touching. If you didn't have that meaning, that experience could be very different. So it's working with those two principles of like, how do we live life with those resilience factors, which are supported for years through the research. And I'll say one more thing and I'll wrap up because I've been talking. Sense coherence is Aaron Antonovsky. Just want to make sure he was a researcher that researched Holocaust survivors back in the 70s and found these kind of meaning, like predictability in life and confidence were major factors that contributed to quality of life and health impact. And it's been studied for many years since then. And those two factors are really the basis of Roots to Thrive and what we're trying to build in the program, including with the inclusion of medicine-assisted therapy as well.
Thank you for sharing all of that. I got goosebumps, especially when you were talking about how we frame the tasks that we take on in life, and it's really all about practice and self-awareness. And yeah, I just really appreciate hearing your perspective on this. Thank you to Dr. Dames for that insightful introduction to the intersection of nursing, psychedelics, and the study of resilience. We will continue with the second part of our interview in a few moments. Are you curious about trending health topics in your community? Do you want to learn more about how you can better your own health? Listen to A Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM every Thursday from 2 to 3 p.m. Now let us return to the rest of our interview with Dr. Shannon Dames. And just to remind you, if you're picking up on our episode right now, she is a health professional investigator, a professor of nursing at Vancouver Island University, as well as the visioning and research development lead and co-chair of the Roots to Thrive organization. Now, could we dive into your thoughts on the misconceptions about psychedelics that are visible in the current public discourse regarding this topic? I know there's a bit of excitement, but there's also a bit of misconceptions floating around as well.
Yeah, it's I don't know if I'd even couch it as misconceptions so much. I think we have a danger in this culture of objectifying, and we are so out of relationship with so many aspects of who we are, our bodies, just starting with that, like out of relationship with our bodies. And then we become out of relationship with other people because you feel people through your body. And then become out of relationship with like forces that are beyond these bodies and the planet and all the stuff, right? Like we're just out of relationship as long as we are moving around like heads alone. So when you apply a spiritual medicine, and I say that, and from a purely Western perspective, it will invite eye rolls. From an international perspective, where many cultures have been working with these types of medicines for like many, many, many years before colonization and through colonization. When you talk about medicines that, and even the word psychedelic actually means like mind manifesting in the Western, in a lot of other cultures, I think it would be more spirit manifesting would be more accurate. So I think even that right there, right, is these, when you come from a mind-based culture where we have put a lot of our eggs in the mind, or a lot of the eggs in the basket of the mind, there's a misconception that it's that we heal through the mind. We don't heal through the mind. It is a collaborating force inside of the healing process, but our bodies is where all of the trauma is stored, right? It's our bodies that hold on to it. That's really where we're doing a lot of our healing work, and spiritually too. We are a pretty spiritually hungry culture, however you decide to define spiritual. So I think that's just a good place to start is what is healing? How do we heal? And what kind of medicines and relationships with those medicines are required in order to heal? If we could just start there, I think that would be it would nip a lot of the misconceptions right there. Because we don't start there, and we are very used to going to a pharmacy, taking a pill and having it hopefully deal with whatever we're going there for. This is never going to work. It's just never going to work, because that's not how these medicines work. It's a spiritual process. It's an embodied process. It's a somatic process. And I think a lot of, and myself included, so I'm not coming from a place of judgment on others, this is also woven into me. I would much rather go to a pharmacy, take a pill and call it good. And I don't have a relationship with that pill. That's just something that goes in my body without thinking. That's not going to get us there with these medicines. So it's bridging. We need to bridge Western ways of knowing with Indigenous ways of knowing and other ways of knowing, not Indigenous to Canada, so that we can really understand what these bodies actually require to heal, and how Western medicine can be an asset. We're a slice of the solution, but we can't assume that we are the solution, because we're very short-sighted in the bigger picture.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love that. The issues are in the tissues if we're willing to look at them. Hey? Yeah.
Good one. Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about the current laws in Canada related to psychedelics? I know that things are changing right now, especially with MDMA. And I'm curious where things are at from your perspective.
It's going to be a slow walk to regulated access right now. And psychedelics they're psychoactive substances, some that are plant-based, some that are synthetic. And the mechanisms of these tend to be similar. There's a big range on how they work, but in general, they take the nervous system, our default mode network, those patterns thinking, the ego that tends to drive our bus most of the day, and they quiet it. So what happens is that part of ourselves that is like the ordinary state of consciousness that we trust and move in gets hampered, quieted, or even put right offline. And what's left is all the pieces that are not run by the ego. So there's this kind of like coming back into relationship with all of those parts that tend to be very quiet with the noisiness of our kind of default mode. Yeah. So just give a little definition of like, that's kind of psychedelics. There's a lot of them. There's a few that are very common, had a lot of history, like LSD, big history. There was lots of research, and then it became a political hot potato, and now is much slower than the other ones that are coming, just purely because of the politics and how long. It also, the time you're on LSD is much higher, making it hard for therapy. The ones that have become more popular in this kind of reemergence of psychedelics is ketamine, which has been around for a very long time. It is not a classic psychedelic, but it has the same impacts or similar impacts to what I described earlier in terms of like getting people into a non-ordinary state so that there is a potential for another way of seeing and doing. And that is prescribable, and it's been working, especially in the United States. It's been used a lot for mental health. In Canada, it's being used a lot more now. Psilocybin is still criminalized really across Canada and widely acceptable anyway. You can buy it online, you can get it in storefronts, but it is not legal to buy or to carry. So psilocybin, you can only access it legally through Health Canada's Special Access Program. And there are basically, you apply through a doctor. So you have to know a doctor that's willing to apply for you. Doctors aren't paid to do that. So you're either going to have to pay them or they're going to have to volunteer. A little bit of an access barrier there. It is shipped to you if you're approved from a lab. It is not a whole mushroom. So that is also another area of challenge. Some people would prefer to use the natural product. It is an extract or a synthetic. And those are then received by the doctor, who then the team, you can have legal psilocybin-assisted therapy that way. MDMA is very similar. It is recently approved last year through the SAP program. But again, you need to have a doctor that is willing to do that in their off time. So also really challenging for people to get. It's also expensive. The lab fee right now, I believe, is upwards of, I think it's $500 per pill, and it's a series of 3, and they charge for shipping and all the stuff. So it's a very expensive, A, you got to find a doctor that's going to apply for you, and B, you got to be able to pay for just the pill, and C, then you got to pay for the therapy, which is pretty expensive because it takes a couple of therapists to be with you. So yes, we are definitely making efforts and movement on access, and it's still very much a have and have nots system. I kind of like it, looks a bit like a 2-tiered mental health system in Canada right now, and it probably will be for the next couple decades. As long as we are leaning on clinical trials to move us forward, it's not going to change anytime soon.
Yeah, so still some barriers there for sure in terms of universal access. So I think we've covered a bit of info on research and protocol and what's coming next. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I think I would just say, because of the way the political environment is right now, and I realize I'm a bit biased. I live on Vancouver Island. Vancouver Island I don't know, I kind of think it might be the psychedelic capital of the world. I don't know, but it feels that way from my little incubator over here. Yeah. There's a lot of overdose deaths and a lot of mental health. Desperation is maybe too, I don't know, maybe not too harsh of a word, but we as a people, there's a lot of suffering going on right now, and publicly available services are not helping a lot of people. It's not for lack of access, it's just they're just not working. And a lot of people are going into the underground because it's more affordable, more accessible than the Health Canada path. And yeah, I would just say, make sure you're ensuring everything is tested if that is the road you're going down. We are also in a big trend of an adulterated, contaminated drug supply right now, especially in BC. So just really, as people are taking their health into their own hands, which is very understandable, making sure that they're doing it in the safest way possible, so that, yeah, they're limiting their risks.
Absolutely. And just to build on that, what might you suggest, or where might you suggest the public seek reliable information if they are seeking to learn more about psychedelics and health?
Yeah, so there's, in terms of like testing sites, I think it's not necessarily the government of BC that's necessarily offering all the testing. There's also nonprofits, and people are just stepping in and doing it at no cost. So there is the BC, the provincial site, and I do not have it off the top of my head, but there's some pretty solid information out there about drug testing. And you can even just mail it off, like stick a little bit in an envelope, mail it to a place. So you don't even have to go there physically. And then you receive the results by email. So there's a really slick system now. And I've actually gone with clients a number of times in the last 6 months just to understand what the process is like and how it feels. And yeah, so I would just like to say I didn't feel, I felt really welcomed, and there wasn't, I really encourage people to, even though it takes some courage, and if you don't have the courage to go to a site like that, is use the mail-in option. It's really about trying to just remove as many barriers as possible. And I would also just say that the trends are that Canadians are now breaking the law more than ever when it comes to accessing mental health treatment. And I find that, not surprising given our current political environment. But I think it needs to come with a really solid public health approach too. So people are feeling empowered to access these services, and that they're not feeling stigmatized when they do it, because more and more of the general population is accessing them, or accessing unregulated products and services. And we really need to make sure we're all keeping safe.
Absolutely. Yeah. I really appreciate you sharing all of that safety information as well, and providing such important resources for our listeners. And I want to thank you again for sharing your time with us today, and really appreciate you taking the time for the interview. Next up, psychedelic use in Canada with Shan.
According to the Canadian Psychedelic Survey facilitated by the Psychedelic Medicine in 2022, it was revealed that the most used psychedelic drugs in Canada were psilocybin, 3,4-methylene-dioxymethamphetamine or MDMA, and lysergic acid diethylamide or LSD. According to the survey, the top motivations for psychedelic drug use were fun, self-exploration, general mental well-being, and personal growth. Regarding the experiences of respondents who had used psychedelics, about 82% of them reported having intense positive experiences, feeling a sense of connectedness. However, over half of the respondents also had intense challenging experiences, which included confronting difficult emotions, social paranoia, or troubling hallucinations. These challenging experiences pose existential threats to some participants, with concerns about not being the same or fearing death. The most frequent psychedelic use locations according to the study were at natural settings or at home, while friends, a partner, and being alone were the most frequent types of companions during use of psychedelics. Various safe drug testing sites in BC have been offering free anonymous drug checking services so people can reduce the risk of an overdose by checking what is in their substances that may be harmful. People in the mainland Vancouver who may be interested in these services may visit Get Your Drugs Tested and Insight in Vancouver, Safe Point Supervised Consumption Site, and Foxglove Supportive Housing Complex in Surrey, Starship Health Contact Center in New Westminster, and Burnaby Housing and Outreach Hub. While for those people living in Vancouver Island who may be interested in these services may visit Canadian Mental Health Association in Nanaimo, Vancouver Island Drug Checking Project in Victoria, Vancouver Island Mental Health Society in Campbell River, AVI Health and Community Services in Comox Valley, Cowichan Valley Wellness and Recovery Center, Port Alberni Shelter Society, and Island Health Mental Health and Substance Use in Port Hardy. Most of these drug testing sites have on-site checking and drop-off services. To know more about these sites and the services they offer, visit Island Health Drug Checking Services website for more information.
Thank you to Shan for sharing all of those important safety resources with our listeners. Knowledge is power, and we encourage anyone who's unsure about the substance they plan to consume to have it tested. Safety first. Finally, we will hear from Stella regarding the potential applications of psychedelic medicine for palliative care.
Did you know that psychedelics are being studied for use in end-of-life care, also known as palliative care? Researchers are using psilocybin to combat depression, anxiety, and other psychological distress that arises when dealing with terminal illness. Psilocybin is a natural occurring psychedelic compound found in what's known as magic mushrooms. Palliative care is focused on symptom management and relieving pain. However, often individuals facing end-of-life care experience symptoms of anxiety and depression. The use of psilocybin in recent research has been shown to relieve symptoms of anxiety and depression, as well as promote a more peaceful end of life. According to the Journal of Mental Health and Addictions, a dose of psilocybin was successful in decreasing symptoms related to depression and anxiety for end-of-life patients to treat cancer-related anxiety and depression in end-of-life care. This treatment resulted in a decrease in symptoms related to depression and anxiety, leading to an increased quality of life and more peaceful end of life. Even 6 months later, 80% of patients reported their symptoms were still lower than before receiving the treatment, which shows the long-term holistic care psilocybin can provide patients. During recent trials, no adverse events were reported, and any nausea or hypertension that occurred went away at the end of the session. This is very promising and shows the need for greater research into psychedelics and other treatments for mental disorders, such as anxiety and depression, especially in providing holistic care during end-of-life treatment. Providing true holistic care to clients requires new treatments to be made, and psychedelics, while still very known, could be the key. Being able to expand treatment to do more than physical symptom management is a huge turning point for palliative care, and the only way to continue on this path is by more research and education to take place.
Thank you to Stella for that enlightening segment. We are very lucky to have some of the research Stella mentioned happening right here on Vancouver Island, including the work of our guest today, Dr. Shannon Dames. Once again, we extend a big thank you to Dr. Dames for sharing her knowledge with us today. I also want to thank my co-hosts, Stella, Cedric, and Shan, for sharing current research information about psychedelics and health with our listeners. And finally, thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into our episode today. For details and show notes from today's episode, or to follow along on what's coming up this season, check out our Facebook page, A Sound Constitution, our Instagram, CHLY, A Sound Constitution, or our Twitter at ASC_VIU. If you've missed parts of this episode, or would like to listen to this episode or episodes from our past shows, check out our YouTube at A Sound Constitution. Otherwise, we'll see you all next week.